We're here today at King's College London with Dr. Sentance, who's a senior lecturer here in computer science education, and we're going to be discussing the broad area of research into computing education. Sue, it's great to be here. Thank you very much for having us. How useful is computing education research for the typical classroom teacher?
Well, I think potentially it can be very useful, but for some teachers it's not really very accessible. So I think in computing in school we have, as academics, responsibility to try and make the research a little bit more accessible for teachers. And it can be inaccessible in very practical ways, in the fact that it's not possible for somebody not at university to be able to access the research.
Too many of the academic papers are behind academic paywalls.
Yes, so that's changing with more open access principles. And also because there's so many studies in different areas, and as a busy teacher you don't really have time to go through all that sort of literature. So what we could do with is clear signposting to relevant research that is can be directly applied to teaching, or summaries of the debates in the fields and what that means for teachers.
Is CAS doing that at the moment?
Well, we've developed in CAS a group called Computing at School Research, CAS Research, which has been a group of academics talking about these things, but out of this has come a research stream at the conference, annual conference in June, so that's very exciting. We're doing that for the second time this June.
And these are predominantly academics presenting research, or teachers talking about research?
Well, in this, in June, we will be having, there's 3 sessions run by teachers, and then 1 session run by me on kind of doing exactly what I just said, trying to sort of summarise the sort of state of research for teachers.
Sounds great.
But the 3 sessions run by teachers, with 1 primary, 2 in secondary, and there'll be the teachers that have been doing research in the teaching project, research project I'll talk about later. Those teachers will be presenting what they've been doing, because the whole ethos of CAS is around a peer-to-peer model.
Yes.
So teachers interested in research can help and support other teachers interested in research.
That sounds great, thank you. There's plenty of research being done at undergraduate level into effective practice in computer science education. Can you give us an overview of what the findings are from that?
Yes, I mean you're very right in that there has been quite a long history of research on how students learn, particularly programming, in their first, second years of undergraduate degrees. So we can learn something from this. I was just going to pick out a few of the sort of headlines from this research. The first is the work around read before you write in programming. So this idea about tracing code, and a lot emanates from Raymond Lister in Australia and other colleagues of his.
Code comprehension comes before code composition.
Yes, so in 2011 he said that really you should be able to trace code in 50% accuracy before you start to write code. And there's
evidence to support that.
Yes, and there's a lot of experimental evidence being done around this with undergraduate students. And I think there is something there that teachers could take on board before they give students a blank idle window.
There's some Python code. What will it do when we run this before anybody's asked to go and write a Python program?
Yes, yeah. Another area of research is the growth mindset. So there's a lot of talk about growth mindset in teaching anyway, but the idea of growth mindset is that you believe that you can progress, as opposed to a fixed mindset where you feel you maybe are bad at computing. And Quintin Butts did a paper on this with his undergraduates in 2010, and I think we could do with more studies in schools to see how when we're moving into a computing for all culture, we don't have students selecting themselves to do computing from age 5.
And that does seem to be the big difference between our approach to an entitlement curriculum for computing and the undergraduate self-selecting sample.
Yes, that's right. So there are differences to the audience of these. The other areas that I was going to mention.
The growth mindset thing I think is very interesting. Do you think it's true that this experience of having to fix programs, of having to have a reasonably positive attitude to one's own mistakes in programming, can help grow a student's mindset?
Well, I think it's a lot about resilience
Yeah.
and being able to accept that through making a mistake you might learn something.
Quite. Yes.
Which isn't the opposite in some other subject areas. So it is a subject where I think you need that kind of mindset to progress. And unfortunately, it's an area where lots of students may feel, for whatever reasons, that it's something that they can't do.
Because of ingrained habits of I don't want to get this wrong from other areas.
Yes.
Okay.
So there's and I was looking last year as a PhD student just starting in California who's starting to do some work on looking at this. So I'm sure there'll be more research to come.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, I interrupted you. Other areas?
Yes, so another area is the idea of the programming misconceptions and how our kind of mental model of what the computer looks like. And the idea by a researcher in Finland called Juha Sorva, he did his PhD thesis on finding all about programming misconceptions. That was all applied to undergraduates. He says he works with it's working with undergraduates, but I think there's a lot in there that we can take and use in school.
Is your view that generally we're sort of leaving that development of the notional machine of a young person's understanding of what a computer is, how a computer works, pretty much to chance in school?
Well, I think it's just something that we need to research because we don't have much evidence at school level of what a student's understanding, or their mental model of a machine is, and that would be one of the key research questions I think that people should be looking at. Another area that's been researched quite substantially at university level is peer instruction. And peer instruction is a mechanism where you use multiple choice questions in big lecture theatres with very, very carefully chosen alternatives that are supposed to test students' mental models. And it's been shown through maths and physics as well as computer science to be a really good way of identifying where students' misconceptions are. And it works in a way that you have to discuss your answers with the group and commit to an answer in a group, and then the class is around. It's sort of flipped classroom approach. It's about discussing different answers. Seems to me that might be a useful area that we can use quite.
The questions that are being developed for Project Quantum would, I hope, be very useful.
Yes, those multiple choice questions, when they're developed, would be ideal for that kind of approach. And you'll find lots of papers on peer instruction around. And the final area I was going to talk about was pair programming. So initially the research in pair programming was done in industry, part of the agile programming methodology. Then it moved into universities and was shown to be effective with students talking to each other while they're programming. And now there's an increasing number of papers looking at middle school in America, which is our kind of key stage 3. Using pair programming and it being quite good for engaging girls and able to talk about their programs, and the idea of discourse around a program as identifying what's wrong with it. And it's a very useful strategy in schools. Firstly, because if you've got people working in pairs, you have half as many people with their hand up, and secondly, because they don't feel they've discussed with somebody else the nature of their problem before they ask for help, so a bit more secure that actually it is a problem and don't feel so awkward. So I think there's a lot of that can be used for schools.
But I've heard stories from secondary colleagues about not wanting to do pair programming because children won't be allowed to work with a partner when it comes to controlled assessment tasks for GCSE.
I don't think we should. Well, there's an education question, is there? Should we always be teaching people through their education in a way that is going to be examined when they're in their examination? We teach.
I think you know my view on that.
Yes, we teach up until examinations in a way that we think is the right way to teach people to learn, not just we don't start preparing students for examinations until
preparing for the opportunities, responsibilities and experiences of later life rather than merely getting a GCSE perhaps.
Yes. So I mean, and teachers understand about this, and that it's education, the way that you are working with students is you use your gut instinct in a way, the way that you think that they will learn.
How much of that undergraduate CS education research does transfer into the school sector?
I think a lot of the research is around novice programming. Will actually transfer, because we are still talking about novice programmers. They're of a different age, but so I think a lot of that will transfer. There is a lot of undergraduate research around tools, building visualization environments and that sort of thing. That may, in a simplified form, also be useful to transfer into schools. But I think I wouldn't say there's things that don't transfer. I think it's the fact that in schools we need additional research, because we don't have this self-selecting population. We have computing for all, so we need to look at how we make computing accessible. We look into diversity, inclusion, students with special needs, how we can make computing readily accessible by everybody.
What evidence is emerging from research into computing education at school level?
So there are a few areas that are being worked on. I'm just highlighting a couple. There's work in block-based programming, and there's been papers about Scratch for some time, but even in the last year there's been some really interesting new research. So there's a paper last summer by Price and Barnes talked about the way that experimentally looked at students using a block-based environment and text-based environment to do exactly the same task with the same outputs, and actually found that there was no difference in perceived difficulty or attitudes using these two different environments, but the speed in which they were able to reach their answer that was better with block-based environment. So
because of the cognitive load that text-based programming brings with it, do you think?
Yes, presumably. And other research by Weintraub and Wilinski has been looking at students' perception of block-based languages and what they think are the things that make them easier and what the drawbacks are. And the drawbacks for block-based languages, according to students, are the sort of non-authentic kind of nature and the lack of sort of advanced features, that sort of thing. So, as well as the research that's been telling us that Scratch is marvellous, which had lots of papers like that for a while, that we're now emerging sort of quite serious, rigorous research that schools will be able to use in terms of how to use block-based. And then, of course, built on that research are new tool developments like Greenfoot 3 with the frame-based editing, which is, building on the research that we have about environments that students find easy. Another area I think that's coming out as useful for schools is the area of sub-goal labelling for problem solving.
Okay, can you explain that?
So sub-goal labelling is a technique that comes from the domain of problem solving in all different sort of areas, and says that because of cognitive load, because we have so many things to think about, having worked examples is a good way of working, and that having steps to go through worked examples is a good idea of working. And sub-goal labelling takes that one step further, because it talks about grouping steps and labelling them so that you can remember groups of steps and sub-goals that you have to work towards in working through this problem.
And that is something that the teacher would do, that create the scaffold of the sub-goals for their students.
Yes, so a very recent paper in this area has just shown that although it's very useful in undergraduate programmes to use sub-goal labelling, it was even more useful with teachers who are K-12 teachers, because that's what they call them in the States. Teachers who are trained to teach computer science found it was shown that it was even more useful for them to use sub-goal labelling. It recommends that this sort of strategy of breaking down problems and labelling groups is a good one. So that's another area of research I think that's interesting for schools. And a third area is this whole bit thing about building things, being creative. And I would point to the work of Yasmin Kafai in this, who's been around for a long time and done some wonderful, rigorous work in how building things, computational participation, working in groups, computational textiles, and that whole kind of making culture and how that can support learning in school
I suppose
and
that
out of
goes back
school.
to Pappett's work on constructionism and children learning through making things to children.
Yes, so I think her work is very much based on that. But I think
Yes.
it's an area of research that has a lot to say for
Mm.
teachers sort of grappling with a new curriculum and looking for interesting ways of doing things.
Okay, so I think that takes us on very nicely to some of your own recent research into teachers' perspectives on some of the challenges and some of their strategies in implementing the new curriculum. What have you found?
Yes, well, we did a little bit of research off the back of one of the CAS surveys recently, when over 300 teachers volunteered to give their write some paragraphs for us on good strategies they were using in teaching computing. And having gone through all these masses of text, we were able to see 5 themes emerging.
Oh.
And these 5 themes were, firstly, they're not in any order, so I'll just say firstly, in contextualising, making what you're teaching relevant to things that have some connection in the real world, using analogy, those sorts of things. And this was a strategy that teachers were using.
Yes.
Another strategy was about using kinesthetic or unplug type activities. So taking students away from the computer, doing sort of activities that CS for Fun and Paul Curzon and Tim Bell and CS Unplugged, and that we have a lot of exposure to these sorts of ideas, but we can all think of new examples. So thinking of examples off the computer, and lots of teachers, primary and secondary, were talking about using these. Another area was working together, getting students working in groups, problem solving together, ideas of pair programming. A fourth area was about bringing in computational thinking, and particularly teachers mentioned about decomposing problems. So trying to sort of break things down for students to be able to see the generalised view, and
which I guess
and
relates to that sub-goal labelling that you were talking about earlier.
Yes, definitely. And then the final area was particularly about programming. Teachers talked about scaffolding code, doing coding type exercises where you had gaps in code, or you built on examples of incorrect code, or lots of different approaches, but I sort of grouped them basically around kind of using existing code as scaffold and manipulating code. And so many different teachers came up with that as a strategy. It was really
fascinating to see how, for a subject that was not taught, or was very rarely taught at this level until just 2-3 years ago, that this seems to have been a consensus of what is effective practice emerging from the profession itself.
Yes, and this is it's the peer-to-peer model.
Yes.
Teachers are getting ideas from other teachers. Of course, we have all these master teachers who are, be able to share with teachers good things that they've used, strategies they've used in their classroom.
And that they've heard others use.
Yes, and this sort of network of ideas and strategies is spreading. So it's really interesting.
It's very interesting. And teachers now are getting involved in action research themselves. Can you tell us some of the projects that you're aware of teachers doing when they're researching their own practice or practice in their own schools?
Yes, well, that's a really interesting area. I mean, we've had decades of research telling us that it's good for your professional development to do action research. We know that that's a good thing. So in computing, it's also a good thing for teachers to be doing classroom-based research. So we've had a little project trying to facilitate that for teachers. And it is really interesting what they've chosen as their research questions. So I'll give some examples of a primary teacher who's looking at perseverance in children through in their learning. A couple of teachers working together, looking on their project is called "Is Coding the New Literacy?" So looking at how computational thinking can help students, particularly SEN students, with literacy. A group of teachers looking at gender and how the perception of gender changes from Key Stage 1 to Key Stage 5.
Isn't that
so they've got teachers in their group that are within all 5. That cross all 5 key stages.
Other examples?
So we have a teacher who's been looking at how child-led teaching, had some children teaching teachers Minecraft, could actually be useful sort of a strategy in the classroom. And then a couple of projects on how we could, strategies to use to teach computational thinking, projects about flowcharts in the computing curriculum. So a real range of topics that teachers chose to research.
Is it too early to say what findings are emerging from any of these projects?
You have to come to the CAS conference where the teachers will be presenting their findings.
And will there be an online repository of these reports?
Yes, so we're planning to put their case studies on the web page and make a printed booklet with a summary of their findings.
So
and we're also hoping that we can carry this on next year.
Yes.
So if any teachers are interested in research and classroom-based research, we're hoping to widen our CAS research network to include any teacher who's interested, and then have more tips and things about carrying out your own research projects.
That's brilliant. How easy is it for a teacher to engage in a research project in their classroom?
I think it's not always that easy when you're very busy.
Yes, of course.
So what CAS has tried to do is to try and give teachers a bit of time, money for time, and then support. So we had a ratio of like 1 to 3 academics to teachers on this particular project to help with the background of data analysis and that sort of thing. Yeah. So I think teachers are perfectly able to do this sort of research, but I think in busy lives that having the support there is better. So,
do you have particular tips for a teacher who wanted to do some action research with their own class or in their own school?
Yes, I would say that 3 things. First of all would be to really focus what you want to do. So, and these are some of the lessons that we've actually learned from doing this project, because of course we all make mistakes. We improve on
it's debugging.
What we've done.
It's a bit of a viral problem.
So I would say just to focus on very specifically on one thing.
Yes.
So you don't end up with massive amount of data.
Yes. The
that
teacher
points in all
attempting to
different
answer what is effective pedagogy in computing.
direction. Yes.
So very much broad.
So just focus on a sort of tightly focused area. Second thing is make sure that all your gatekeepers and everything are aware that you're doing this. Sort of the ethics side. That you don't use the data from your students, your children, without getting all the appropriate permissions.
So what do you see as the still unanswered questions in computing education research? What are going to be the next big things for us to discover?
Well, I think that's a very difficult question. I think there are lots of unanswered questions in this field, although we've had a lot of research. I think we do need to have more research about the idea of computing for all, how we can be inclusive, and looking at diversity and inclusion and making sure that everybody has access to a computing curriculum that's intended for everybody.
Yes.
I think there is research to be done about how young can you learn to program, sort of what sort of age, and there's the whole idea of progression, what can you understand at what age. We need a lot of research around that. We obviously need more research about assessment, particularly assessment of computational thinking.
Right.
How if we can we measure computational thinking, or should we not even try?
Anything else?
And what impact learning computing may have on other areas of the curriculum. So literacy and numeracy.
Yes.
And a final thing I would say is, do you need to be good at maths and science to be good at learning computing? Because we don't have any evidence. So that's another area.
We know of schools that won't let people study GCSE computing unless they have particular maths credits.
Exactly. We may instead show that there's a link between languages and computing.
Yes.
So there are lots of unanswered questions.
Tremendously exciting times to be researching.
It is, yes. So I'd urge everybody to get involved with research.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Sue. Thank you. Subscribe to CAS TV on YouTube for the great content that we've got coming up soon.